Hello and welcome to another episode of Just a Dog Podcast, the podcast for thoughtful dog lovers and guardians. I am your host, Nadine. In today's episode, I speak with clinical animal behaviourist Tom Candy, whose career began in rescue at 15 and has carried him through the frontline realities of shelter work, behaviour support and staff training. Tom brings a steady, considered voice to subjects that are often emotionally charged, and his experience within large rescue systems gives him a perspective that many of us do not usually hear. The conversation moves across a broad landscape touching on pressures facing shelters, the changing expectations placed on dogs, the role of behaviour modification, medication, and the emotional reality of supporting animals and people during difficult times. This episode offers a window into a part of the dog world shaped by responsibility, caution, compassion, and systemic pressure. It is a different kind of conversation, but a meaningful one. Let's begin. Tom, thank you so much for joining me on Just a Dog Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am super excited to have you on the podcast because you have a very long history of working with dogs in rescue. I'd love to learn a little bit more about your journey.
I was always really passionate about animals. I was always interested in animals. And we never had pets growing up, but I just had this affinity or attraction for any animals that I came across, really. We used to spend a lot of time in the kind of West Wales countryside, and I'd always walk down the lane and stand, with the horses that lived in the nearby field and whatnot. I guess I'm sort of that age where there wasn't a lot of scope in animal careers. It was kind of you were pushed towards veterinary. And at the time, I definitely felt like I wanted to be a vet. That was my interest. That was my kind of passion early on. So, in the UK, as part of kind of applications for veterinary medicine, you tend to have to do work experience to demonstrate that interest and that drive. So like you said, when I was about 15, I started volunteering for Hope Rescue Wales, which is a medium-sized rescue in South Wales in the UK. And my idea was that it would be like a couple of weeks. It looks good on your CV. I'd get some nice interactions with dogs and people. And the first event that I went to was about March time, so it was freezing cold. And we were at Pets at Home, and we stood outside Pets at Home fundraising and telling people about the charity. And I got given this little dog to look after called Faith. And Faith was a Staffordshire Terrier, and she was recovering from mange. So she had sort of a lot of fur loss, and the fur was growing back. And she had this little black dog with this purple jumper on. And I looked after her for the day, and I told people her story. And I sort of knew at that point, regardless of where my career went in terms of whether I was a vet, whether I did something else, rescue and shelter was really where I wanted to be. So even from that one interaction, it really solidified my passion in this industry. So I continued kind of volunteering at fundraising events. I moved on to transporting, so moving dogs from the pounds or from Hope Rescue to other organisations, bigger organisations that could support the needs of the charity. I started doing home checking. And, this wider introduction to the rescue world, again, kind of just solidified that career path for me. After that, I went to university and I did a bioveterinary degree because I still wasn't sure whether veterinary was where I wanted to go. But through doing that, I actually fell in love with animal behaviour. And then I did a master's in clinical animal behaviour. And then since then, the last kind of 11 years, I've worked full-time in animal behaviour in rescue and sheltering. So, yeah. It's really cool. It's tricky, as you can imagine, but it's a real privilege as a job.
I can imagine there are some really, really tough days and possibly some really rewarding days as well. But before we kind of go into that, I'm curious to learn whether you had any kind of preconceived ideas about dogs before you started working with them, and how has that changed over time?
That's a really great question. Because we did get a family dog, so actually around the same time as I started volunteering with Hope, we got a little Cavalier cross called Tia. So that was our first kind of family pet, and she was amazing. She was like so easy, and it was just really simple. We did some training with her, but she pretty much came as like a ready-made package of a dog. She was pretty cool, but obviously I had spent a lot of time already volunteering in rescues. I suppose I had quite a wide ranging view of dogs anyway. What's maybe changed over the last kind of 15 years is the idea of individuality within dogs. I think we see that more and more in the more work I do. You have a preconceived idea when you go into a kennel to work with a dog, or when you work with a foster home, and they always kind of take you by surprise and change things. So, we do see similarities within breeds, we do see similarities within groups, but every dog is that individual. They've got individual wants, individual needs, and all of that plays into their behavior, and obviously how we approach it or how that manifests. And I think that's really what's kind of changed for me is that, very set, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to approach this situation, whereas now I'm a lot more fluid, kind of wait and see what happens a lot of the time, and then build off that kind of rapport with each individual dog, rather than thinking, right, okay, this is the plan for the day, this is the plan for this session. So I guess that's the biggest change I can think of.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I think it takes a certain kind of skill to see dogs as individuals. You kind of, depending on how you grew up and what kind of ideas were passed on to you, you kind of have to jig your brain in some way to start looking at dogs as more than instead of less than, and consider their experience within our very human world. Have you noticed anything with regards to people, you said home visits, their beliefs around dogs and how dogs should be treated and how dogs are treated in reality?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Again, I work a lot internationally, so across different countries, and there's a real big difference across the world at how animals are perceived, how animals are treated. And that actually affects our own perception as well, which is really interesting. And I'll probably talk about that in a minute. But when we think about here in the UK, we have seen a massive shift in our approach to dogs and dog ownership. And obviously, the one thing the UK is famous for is dog's a man's best friend, and Britain is a nation of dog lovers. And I genuinely still believe that's true, but through the last kind of 20, 30 years, maybe, I think things are starting to shift. So we've gone from, like you said, that idea of dogs are dogs and they're just there, and, maybe they used to live outside, or they used to kind of just free roam during the day and nobody really was too bothered about what they were up to the kind of complete opposite of that on the spectrum, where we've now kind of got fur babies and dogs are kind of extensions of their owner, and we see those kind of small dogs being carried around in bags as almost like fashion accessories and stuff, and we have everything in between. I think what we tend to be seeing from the kind of general public is dogs just fit much more into that family model, which is, in my opinion, is really great. So we're starting to see things like people not being too bothered about if the dog's getting on the sofa, as long as they're not, dirty and muddy. We're seeing an increase in dog-friendly spaces like pubs, like cafes, like restaurants. We see a lot more people now going on dog-friendly holidays in the UK, because, whereas before we used to just put our dogs into kennels and go away for 2 weeks, they want them to become part of that holiday, part of that adventure, and part of the memories. So we've still got this massive scope and massive range of perceptions of dogs, but I think there is now a narrowing of how they fit into our life. And it is much more that kind of two-way relationship, which, like I said, I think is really cool. There's been another sort of little shift, though, particularly post-COVID, and particularly with the way that dogs are represented currently in the media, particularly around their behaviour, where we're now starting to put quite a lot of expectations on dogs. And that sometimes can lead to conflict in the way that we think about our dogs and the way that we approach it. So, a classic example of this, and take this with a pinch of salt. I'm not saying this is right either, and we can obviously dive into it after. But, a few years ago, it was very common conversation to be like, don't approach the dog while they're eating. Leave sleeping dogs lie. Or if the dog growled at you or nipped you, what did you do to upset the dog? And obviously, particularly thinking of our younger members of society. The big shift that we've got now is the expectations on dogs is really high. So we have this expectation that, they should be immaculately behaved all of the time. They should never put a step out of line. They should tolerate being a fur baby, like we said, being picked up, being carried, wearing costumes, wearing clothes. And that's had an impact too. So we've got, actually, in quite a short period of time, this massive shift in how society views dogs, as how we view dogs as individuals, and how dogs are portrayed, which obviously also impacts how we feel about them. So what I mentioned earlier on about that kind of different culture, often what we do is we look at cultures where dogs are more free living. So if we think of India, some of the European continents, and we see these dogs and we see them as maybe suffering or having poor welfare because they're not living in a home, they're not having that kind of constant family love. Whereas actually those dogs are pretty happy. They've got a pretty good life. Particularly in India, they're community dogs. So they're looked after by the community, they're fed, they are taken care of. They just don't live in houses. But culturally, that's a very different perception than what we've got over here. So it's really interesting. Just that one question I could probably talk about all day. And I think that's, as we kind of just mentioned, that is one of the big shifts that we've seen, is this kind of anthropomorphism of dogs, that putting human beliefs or human feelings onto our dogs, and doing things like dressing up, like you said. I don't want to talk about it all the time, but post-COVID, we know that as a species, humans are less resilient. We've gone through this massive pandemic. We've had all of the pressure of lockdown, the kind of cost of living crisis that's followed it, everything that's happened now. We know that we're not as resilient as a culture, as a species, as we have been in the past. And we put that onto dogs as well. So like you said, we often see these kind of dogs abroad living on the street, and we think, oh yeah, we can improve their life by bringing them here, and almost having that guardianship kind of feeling around them.
Yeah.
But like you said, sometimes we bring them here, it's not what they've grown up with, it's not what they're used to, and they really struggle. We also do see really good success stories with foreign rescue dogs. I don't want to kind of tar everything with the same brush, but there are difficulties around that. And that's just really interesting as well, how we kind of have this external pressure that even that changes how we kind of interact and approach our relationship with our dogs.
Yeah. With since COVID, you must have, obviously working in rescue, seen the rise in people rehoming their dogs. Have you seen any trends in terms of specific breeds or breed types, or, like, are they kind of more lap dogs, designer dogs, working dogs? What are some of the trends that you're seeing in terms of what people are kind of struggling with at this moment in time?
Yeah, so when I first started in rescue, like I said, about 15 years ago, it was what I imagine most people think of rescue dogs. It was crossbreeds, it was, bull breeds a lot of the time, especially in South Wales, staffies, larger bull breeds, American bulldogs, those sort of things. They were pretty common. And we used to have kind of like a running joke, really, that, as I said, the Hope Rescue that I was volunteering with at the time kept some dogs from the pounds, but a lot of the dogs that they ended up taking and saving from destruction, they moved to larger organizations that could help support those rehomings. And the running joke was that, we'd have a bog off offer, a buy one get one free offer. So if you take these free staffies, we'll give you the Bichon Frise and the Shih Tzu that we've got as well, because you had to kind of encourage the larger rescues or the other organizations to take the dogs that they were also getting through the door every day. It's really shifted now. I would say now, I couldn't tell you which breed is most common. It's really varied. We see a lot more what you would class as pure breeds. We see a lot more kind of recognizable breeds in rescue now than we've had before, particularly dogs that struggle with medical conditions, particularly larger dogs. So again, we've already just touched on that cost of living crisis and the effect that has. And it was really interesting because when COVID started, we as an industry kind of set up for this flood of dogs. Yeah, people were losing their jobs, they were furloughed, they weren't sure what was going on. We had all this kind of confusion and upset in the country, and everybody thought people are going to start relinquishing their dogs. And it never came. In fact, the opposite happened, and everybody wanted a dog, and you couldn't keep dogs in kennels long enough. People were queuing up at the door to take dogs home, which is great and had a really positive impact on rehoming. But the fallout probably came about 6 months later. People starting to go back to work, people, again, losing their jobs, that cost of living crisis kicking in, and stuff starting to go up. We then saw those numbers start to increase. And like you said, that's a continual trend that we've seen. What we're really seeing at the minute across the board and across nations, as I mentioned, particularly in the States, is rehoming is going down. Less people are looking to get a dog because of all of that financial insecurities, because People are having to have multiple jobs. They've got less time. There's more pressure. People are worried, like we said, and relinquishment is going up for the same reason. So there's more dogs needing our help, and there's less people around to help them, which is obviously a fun place to be in rescue, because that's kind of makes it quite difficult to manage. A really good example of this is when I worked at a individual centre, we had one St. Bernard in the 3 years that I worked there. When I was in a different role, a regional role where I was supporting 5 rescue centres, we had one in every centre at one time in the period of about 2 months. So, it went from 1 in 3 years to having 5 at the same time.
Yeah.
So a massive shift in the breeds that we see. And yeah, so-called designer breeds, Frenchies, Cockapoos, all of those, we see them more and more now.
All being rehomed. And within kind of the networks of rescues that you work with, do you tend to find that they are at capacity?
Yes, space is a big issue at the minute. And part of the issue as well is the capacity to care. So rather than physical space for dogs, it's having the right number of staff to make sure dogs are getting the right needs. And the dogs are becoming a little bit more complicated. So like I said, people are struggling with their veterinary costs. So the dogs coming in have more medical issues. They're struggling with their resilience. So the dogs coming in have more behaviour challenges. And that obviously takes more staff time, more resources, and that puts extra pressure on rescues. So space isn't always the problem. Is that resource impact as well. That being said, we also obviously still have amazing adopters that come in and take these dogs and support these dogs. And as you said, we have bad days, but we do have those kind of really big wins as well. During COVID, we saw a lot of the longer term residents go home because there was less dogs to choose from. So people were kind of considering more options, and some dogs that had been in kennels 2-3 years went home and have lived absolutely amazingly happy lives since that period. So, it is swings and roundabouts, but it's certainly a challenging time in shelter and rescue, as it is across the board for everybody.
Yeah. You come across as really, really positive, which is really, I don't know, refreshing, considering everyone I've spoken to in rescue, and also going to Parliament for the State of UK Rescue meeting, I think towards the end of last year. Were you there?
I was here.
You were there. I probably must have seen you. But yeah, like considering everything that's going on in the last year, and then obviously more recently now the proposal of the new budget, kind of costs going up. And what's your outlook overall about, and this is a big question, I know that, but like your temperature check on the direction we're heading, and do you feel hopeful for the future? In all honesty, and I know that you represent a charity and a rescue and multiple organizations. What's your experience or your outlook on things, because you have such a wide exposure to so many different cases?
I think it's challenging. I'm not gonna lie. It's hard sometimes to see the light at the end of the tunnel, because the pressure is kind of coming from a range of sources, as we've already talked through. I think what has been good, what the silver lining would be, is maybe it has had to focus rescues in to be more collaborative. You mentioned the State of UK Rescue conversation that AppDog is having, the All Parliamentary Working Group for Dog Welfare, but also it's changed the way that we maybe think about rescue. And this is something that I've always been passionate about. Like I said, Hope Rescue that I started with have always been very forward-thinking and wide-ranging with their approach to rescue. The problem is brick-and-mortar rescuing is not the solution to this crisis. If we build more kennels, we'll fill the kennels. The problem is we need to think about source to sea. So what I mean by that is rescue is a reactive industry. So we're here to clean up the mess, fix the pieces, put plasters over things to support animal welfare. And that is fine. And for a lot of years, that was working because, like I said, the number of dogs needing to come in and the number of dogs needing to go out was fairly balanced. What we've kind of identified as an industry now, and what we're moving towards now, is, well, how do we solve the problem at source? So that brings up conversations like, how do we look at ethical and appropriate dog acquisition? So where are our dogs coming from? How do we make sure breeders are doing the best job they can to produce good puppies? How do we hold rescues to higher standards to make sure the dogs who are being rehomed are appropriate and are going to good homes and going to suitable homes, whilst also making sure that it isn't massively restrictive? And I think that'll be a great topic to dive into in a minute, is, the perception of rescues is it's really hard to get a dog. And that's not helpful when we're seeing less people trying to adopt. We need to be welcoming people in and supporting them to make the best decision for their family and the dog. We're looking at things like what legislation exists and how is it going. So we've just had a massive win in the animal welfare world with the new bill that's going to be coming in, which has closed some of the loopholes around importing dogs with crop ears and docked tails. That will impact a lot of dogs and welfare. And there's a lot of other stuff as well that I can't remember off the top of my head.
Import of puppies.
The import of puppies, yeah. There's large organisations and smaller organisations like Dogs Trust, Blue Cross, BATI, Hope Rescue have all kind of contributed to really push this bill through. And it's a massive step in the right direction to put animal welfare back on the podium. In Wales, we've seen the kind of campaign for the ban in greyhound racing, which has been accepted, and there's dates around that now. So we're having to kind of say, right, rescue is not working as it should. We can't continue like this to support animal welfare. How do we fix this gap? We've talked a few times about the cost of animals as well. Well, what does that look like? There was a petition by Dogs Trust last year around reducing VAT on, or it was a couple of years ago now, sorry, but reducing VAT on pet food because people are struggling to feed the pet. We're seeing a lot more food banks and community programs come through organisations like Wood Green and Blue Cross. And we're seeing free behaviour advice and free behaviour support to support owners and keeping pets and owners together. So rather than owners getting to the point where they can't cope and the dog has to come into care, what is most cost effective for a rescue? Supporting that owner with food for a few weeks or months while maybe they've lost their job and they're looking for a new job, or they've had to move house, or that animal coming into care and it costing on average about £50 a day to keep the, how do we support veterinary care? But also, how do we, again, lobby the government to say, and the RCVS, the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons, to say, why are these prices so high? Well, why have we seen this massive inflation of veterinary costs that's led to people not doing it? And again, holding insurance companies to higher accord as well to say, hey, why aren't you paying out for these conditions? And none of that stuff is easy. None of it is going to be a tomorrow fix. Mm-hmm. But I do think, to have better welfare for dogs, to have a sustainable rescue sector, we have to tackle the source and not just the sea. There'll always be a place for the rescue. And none of us want that to go away, because there are so many genuine people in the world who their situation changes, something happens, unfortunately they pass away or they can't look after that animal anymore. We want to make sure that that animal has a safe place to go and can successfully be rehomed to another loving home and have a great life after that initial situation. We're not saying that that won't exist, but if we tackle everything around it as well, it means that actually those dogs are coming in are the ones with the most need. Whereas currently what we're seeing is, just everything's chaos.
Yeah.
So we're getting all of these animals in rather than just a core group that we could support really well and do a really good job with.
Yeah.
Quite a long answer, but there's a lot to do.
There's so much to do. You touched on vet costs and insurance and things. I don't have insurance for Duna, my galgo, but just getting her nails clipped. I took her to the vets 3 weeks ago, just booked a little nail clip. We were there for all of 5 minutes. They only clipped 6 of her nails because the rest were already too short. It cost me £36. And so earlier this week, just on one of our walks, I spotted another vet, and I thought, oh, let me go check. Maybe they maybe a little bit more affordable, and I'll switch vets. £2 for a nail clipping. Do you know? I was just like, how is this possible? I am one of the least tight people you will know, but there's reasonable and there's completely unreasonable, and that is such a basic thing.
I think it is important to say at this point as well, though, we're also not demonizing vets. So it's often not the vets that are setting the prices. It's often not the vets that are, in these conversations. It is the kind of, realistically, it's the large chain corporations that are buying small independent practices that ends up in the price rise happening. And it is insurance. We see it in America, right? In the American health service, everybody's got insurance. So the prices go up because the insurance pays out. There's no hold to accord for the prices, which then means if you're in a situation where you don't have insurance, you then can't afford to pay the costs.
Yeah.
So I think it is really important that we acknowledge that the veterinary industry is a bit broken at the minute, but it's not.
Yeah.
We're not demonizing the vets themselves because they're super important.
Yes, and they have their own challenges going on at the moment. I think language is important, and you were correct to mention that, because when I was talking about vets, I wasn't talking about the actual vet. I was talking about the business of the vets. And so for me, I felt like, who created this business model? This is exploitative. This is not supporting, because ultimately what they want you to do is they're trying to push you into a membership where they get regular income. And I understand that, because you want a recurring revenue model, gives you a bit more predictability, you can plan ahead, you can reinvest, all sorts of things. But again, there's reasonable and there's not so reasonable. And that's just one tiny little factor. So, okay, we've touched on cost now as kind of being a factor of why people are giving up their animals. It's very real and a difficult decision to make. But what about, have you seen things around behavior? And specifically, challenging behaviors in urban environments and expectations placed on dogs in urban environments. Talk me through some of the things that you've been, or perhaps cases, challenges that you've been working on, and maybe more recently.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, I would say there's a large change. Like we said, there was a massive increase in the number of dogs owned in this country. It's not hugely clear from the data, but we're definitely seeing an increase in dogs. More households have dogs than for a large period of time before, and that puts extra pressure. We're also seeing more built up areas than before, so people are changing the way they walk dogs, right? So we said earlier about how a lot of the time dogs are just kind of left to it, or if you live in kind of like a rural area or a different area, your dog spends the majority of their walk off lead. They have much more autonomy. They've got much more choice about who they interact with, who they don't interact with, what they get up to. They're more fulfilled at the end of it. So when we then take dogs and put them into kind of flats or smaller situations, or like we said, people are working more hours, or people are having to commute more and they have less time, that's where we start to see challenges emerge, because there's more dogs to see. You're on lead, so you've got less choice. You're more frustrated. Owners maybe try and put you into situations because they want you to interact with other dogs, for example. They want you to interact with people. I was in a city centre last week with a colleague of mine, actually, so we're both behaviour minded. And there was this little dachshund who was kind of hunched right under a bench like this because a little girl was trying to say hello to her, and the owner was going, come on. So it's such a big part of animal behaviour. Probably the biggest part is our understanding of our dogs, how they're communicating, what they do, and understanding that actually no behaviour is problematic. What it is a challenge in the environment that it's in. So we don't have bad behaviour. Nearly all dog behaviour is natural behaviour that they're designed to do through their genetics, through their learning, through their experience. But it poses a challenge to us because, of course, none of us want a dog who's barking and lunging at other dogs. Nobody wants a dog who maybe is using their teeth to say, can I have a little bit more space, please? We're not saying that dogs shouldn't fit into our life. We need to understand some of those challenges. So if we think about that apartment block, like we just said, dogs don't know that noises are coming from above them and below them. It must be really off-putting, really confusing. And one of the big things for me that clicked with this was an episode of Victoria Stilwell's It's Me or the Dog, where she's working with two chihuahuas, and I talk about this all the time, and she makes the owners lie down on the floor and says, look how scary the world is when you're 2 foot tall, or less. It's a chihuahua. And that's such a big part of working with dog behavior, is helping owners to understand why the dog feels like this, why they're behaving the way they behave, and then looking at how do we adapt that so they feel better in themselves, they feel more comfortable, and therefore they're not needing to show these behaviors that we're maybe concerned about or are problematic. Other examples of that is, as we said with the flat, the scary metal box that eats you at the end of the corridor, right? An elevator where the doors open, you walk into this box, and then all of a sudden you appear in a new place. How strange for a dog. So that's part of it, is the environments we've kind of moved shift dogs into is so different from before, where, you kind of had a lot more space around you. And then, as we kind of touched on earlier, the big difference is expectation. The expectation of what a dog is meant to be and meant to do has massively shifted. And even how we hold them to account compared to other animals. So there's no other animal, including ourselves, that we expect to only go to the toilet when somebody lets them out to go or somebody takes them on a walk. So majority of cats have litter boxes if they don't have outdoor access. Our small furries all have bedding and appropriate bedding that they can toilet in and we clean out. But with our dogs, we kind of expect them to be in the house for 6 hours and not have access to a toilet. So even that one simple thing is really interesting how we approach that as a society.
Quick sidestep. So when I was doing my research, I learned that actually you travel across the world to do conferences and training and things like that. And one of the things that I saw was a suggestion around medication, which I thought was really interesting in terms of behavioral plans. And so I would love for you to kind of touch on that, because my first instinct was, oh no, let's not start drugging our dogs so that they're more compliant. I would love for you to go into it and kind of explain the thinking behind that, because I know that was geared towards the industry, and this podcast is geared towards both people already working with dogs, but also regular dog people like myself. So help me understand what you meant by that.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great conversation that I'm just going to slightly caveat to start with by saying I'm not a vet. So any conversations around the appropriateness of medication, should be done with a veterinarian, so that they can obviously prescribe and consider things appropriately. But it's definitely something we can dive into. I think, again, this is something that the perception is changing, and in my opinion, it's changing for the better. And part of the concerns around the use of medication that affects a dog's behaviour or supports a dog's behaviour is there's a lot of kind of misinformation or concerns from older information, basically. So often, lots of practitioners, including those working in rescue, including those working with owners, alongside a vet or a veterinary behaviourist, will use behaviour medication, but medication that affects the brain, to support training and behaviour plan. And that's the first very important part, is medication is always an adjunct to a behaviour modification plan. It's not going to fix any problems by itself, and that's not what we're looking to do. But we have situations where either the environment is very difficult to control, we're unable to change things to make that dog comfortable or get them in a place where they can learn successfully. There's some situations where learning is really well established. The dog's had a certain behaviour for a large period of time, or where there's kind of big changes happening in the brain. The dog's maybe had what some people would consider sort of trauma responses or really negative experiences that are hard to help the dog overcome just through training and just through behaviour modification. So we have certain medications that affect the brain in a positive way and normally look to boost things like dopamine, serotonin, things that make us feel good in ourselves. And it is quite interesting, or we'll swing back to it, but it's quite interesting as well that our perception in the UK is often very different to other countries, because I think medication is pretty taboo in the UK generally, right? We probably don't know how many of our friends are on antidepressant medication or similar sort of medication, because we just don't really talk about mental health as a society for people, let alone our animals. In other countries where it is a lot more common, you see behaviour medication being used a lot more, or at least talked about a lot more. So that's one consideration for us to have. But I mentioned earlier about some of the misconceptions, and sometimes we hear comments like, we don't want our dog to be a zombie. We don't want to change their personality. We don't want them to be sedated. We don't want them to change things. And that's totally right. I don't want that either if I'm working with a vet to have it. And that comes from a mixture of things. Some of the older medication that used to be used was not as good as the medication that we have now. It has different properties. It does different things. And you did sort of see these kind of zombie dogs. And that's not what we're going for. What we're aiming for is to create an environment for the dog where they can learn, they can change how they feel, and they can improve welfare. So my view of it, not everybody agrees with this view, but my view of it is certainly if we've got a dog who's painful, we'll use something like pain relief to improve welfare temporarily whilst we also look at resolving the problem. Why would we not use something that can improve welfare to support a dog as long as all of the right plans are in place? It's not a perfect science, so sometimes there's tweaking and changing that needs to be done to get that medication right, and that's why it's really important that you do work with a veterinarian and a behaviourist who can work together to kind of get the best plan possible for that dog. But I've used medication in a range of cases where it has saved that dog's life. And then I've used, there's other cases which are really similar where we haven't reached for medication for a range of reasons. So it's definitely not every dog should be on drugs. It's definitely not we should never reach for this or this should be a last resort, because it's just a tool in our toolbox, like everything else that we do, whether we're using a clicker or treats versus a toy, whatever the situation is, we're always kind of looking for that individual approach. I think a big thing and a big similarity that we are seeing with the NHS currently and our veterinary industry is the relationship-based approach. And that's disappearing for a range of reasons that is not in control of the practitioners on either side. But, gone are the days where you had a family GP who saw you as a baby and stayed pretty much with you the whole time and probably helped you with your babies. And they know your history. They know, conversations that you've had in the past. You talk about things regularly because you see the same doctor every time. Touch wood, I'm not ill very often. I don't have to speak to my GP very much at all. And about probably 4 or 5 years into living in Devon, I had to have a phone call with the GP for something, I can't remember what it was, nothing major. And the doctor that rang me said, my name's Dr. So-and-so. I actually think I'm your GP. And I was like, I've never met you. And it's such a strange idea, really. And veterinary is going the same because, again, of large corporates and there not being enough vets, because there generally is not enough vets, particularly in rural areas. It means that often we're having to see locums or we're seeing different vets that we don't have. And we don't have a consistency of care. So you don't build a rapport with your vet. You don't build a relationship. And that does affect trust, which is what you've just mentioned. But it also affects the vet's judgment because they are literally making decisions based on 10 minutes of consultation. And that is where kind of the paraprofessional approach helps. So, like I said, working with behaviourists, working with physios, working with farriers if it's horses, all of these people that contribute to the welfare of an animal, if they work together, then that information is just better. The decision making is better. All of these things are better. So, my ideal, if I could change the world tomorrow answer, is that we just had one consistent vet pretty much for the entire life of our animal who we could speak to regularly if we had any concerns. Another example of that, actually, whilst I'm on the subject, is our dog. What did she eat? Our dog ate some chocolate. She never normally eats chocolate, but she did get access to some, and my partner was really quite worried. And through our insurance, we've got access to like one of the the vets on call, and it was amazing because the 10:30 at night, and we put it into the app, and it said, "Yeah, vet will ring you back." And it was a fully qualified vet, and she was sat on her sofa. And we were FaceTiming, and we just had a conversation about how much chocolate the dog had eaten, and it was very minimal. It wasn't a concern at all.
Yeah.
And it was great. What a great conversation. And the vet was like a bit chatty, even though it was like 10:30 at night. And then they were like, "Yeah, bring us back any problems." As you said, if we're paying £36 for a nail clip, how much would that conversation have cost if it wasn't a free service through our insurance company or wherever we get it? I think it is our insurance company. So if I could change the world tomorrow, I think having more of a relationship model of health would hugely improve things, both for the vets and for our GPs and whatnot. But in the meantime, thinking about how we use paraprofessionals, and part of the challenge is waiting and people not waiting. Because in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, if we tackle behaviour challenges early on, then we don't need to reach for behaviour medication because we give the dog appropriate strategies before the problem becomes too big. Similar with health conditions. One of the biggest issues that we're seeing with the cost rise is people are putting off going to the vets because they don't have the money. So they wait and they wait and they wait, and the dog gets worse and worse and worse. And then when you come to treat the problem, it costs you 3 or 4 times the amount because that 1 week course of antibiotics has now turned into a surgery, an overnight stay in the emergency vets because you've waited and now it's 12 o'clock on a Sunday evening or whatever, pushes pressure too, right? Because if the vets are having these emergency consults, they take up more time. So then your next patient's late, blah, blah, blah. And that's how, like, as you said, when we're in a money creating scheme, that's why our vet appointments are like 10 minutes and the vets don't have times to write notes up because they're all smushed together.
Mm.
And I think that's the biggest challenge is everybody is just under so much pressure that it's almost impossible to look out. And that's why having a 2-hour behavior consultation with a behaviorist who can then have a conversation with your vet and say, hey, these are the challenges I think this client's facing with the dog. How can we create a One Health plan? That's often the phrase you hear now, a One Health plan to support this dog. And that versus going into the vet who sees you for 10 minutes and then might, like you said, go try this medication because it gets you out of the door and they can see the next client. And as we've said throughout this, that's not the vet's fault. But these are the situations that we're all being put into.
The more conversations we have and the more transparency there is, the easier it is to see the landscape of what we're dealing with, because there will be some solutions that can overlap
100%.
various issues. But unless people talk about it, they don't come to the surface. For me, for example, as simple as getting the dog's nails clipped, I had no idea that's how much things cost. And it's really bizarre because when something like that shapes a person's decision making going forward, there's a lot of different things that you start thinking, okay, what else don't I know? And how can I be more prepared? And so these things, they really matter. Let's think of a lighter, I guess, story. Think of a dog, an experience that you've had with a dog that taught you something about yourself. Yeah.
Really interesting. Really great question. I think it's hard to answer because they all do. That's the problem. There's obviously dogs that stick with you when you work in rescue. You always have that one dog that you do struggle to let go of. Or we often talk in rescues that use foster homes, we often talk about failed fostering, which is such a strange phrase because it basically means that you've been fostering this dog and you've fallen in love and you've decided to keep the dog. The conversation you said you're currently kind of going through in your mind, and it's labeled as failed fostering because it often means you can't foster again. But it's not a failure because that dog has found an amazing home and you found an amazing, or the person's found an amazing dog. So all of the dogs that we work with impact us and make us reflect on ourselves. I've definitely been in situations where I've been really frustrated and really struggled because you just think, oh, I just wish you'd speak English. I just wish you would not bark at that person and then you would get home much quicker. Or I just wish you could do this or that or not do this. And then I've also had times where I'm just amazed by how resilient dogs are, how they can go through these negative experiences and come out the other side. I remember one of the first dogs that I fostered really early on, like when I was in my teens, we were still living at home. We had this farm collie called Toby, and he had a broken leg, and he came from the vets in this ridiculous cast that was kind of up to his shoulder. It was bright red, it was massive, and we only had him overnight, so that he didn't have to be in kennels. And he jumped the garden fence, and I just remember thinking, like, how amazing is it? Sorry, I missed part of the story that's quite important. So the part of the story that I've missed is the reason that he came into the rescue was he was a farm collie. He'd broken his leg, and the farmer didn't want to treat him. So the farmer took him to be put to sleep, and the vet rang the rescue and said, "Hey, we've got this lovely dog. Could you foot the bill? Essentially, could you pay for the repair?" Which obviously they said yes. The dog came to us overnight. So this idea that this dog jumped the fence and obviously I don't know what he was thinking, but in my opinion, an attempt to get back to that farmer, to that owner, to the life that they knew, even though he'd basically been abandoned. And I think we're so lucky with dogs, and we're so privileged to have dogs, cats, other animals that just love us unconditionally, even though they might go through these horrible experiences. And like you said, rescue can be a very dark and difficult place at times where you see things that aren't nice and aren't great, and as animal lovers we would hope to never see. But we also see the recovery of those dogs, and there's so many dogs where you go into their kennel and they're pressing themselves against the wall. They're so scared about the environment that they're in, even if nothing bad's happened to them. Kennels are not a nice place for animals to be. And 2 days later, 3 days later, they're kind of sat on your lap. They're loving you, and it's an amazing feeling. And I think this is why we are a nation of dog lovers, because they give back so much, and all of the hardships that we've talked about during this episode just makes it worthwhile, doesn't it? When you see that waggy tail when you walk in, whether it's a kennel or your house, you see that nice waggy tail in the morning, or when you get home from work, and you just have this amazing friend that loves you unconditionally. I think the big thing is, as we talked about earlier, that the dogs can't speak, can they? So we really have to shift our thinking about what that individual is experiencing, and particularly as a behaviourist, help owners to understand that too. And I do think that changes how you then approach things with people. Because even though we can communicate and we can speak, we're often not the best at actually showing how we're feeling, what our concerns are. So I think how we approach those kind of conversations with dogs and the learning that we take from dogs then affects how we do that with people. Because you get that read of, well, you're saying this, but your behavior is telling me this, or I'm not sure that's right. So when you say about how we approach relationships and things, I think that is massively influential in how I approach things, because I'm so used to working with these animals where you're trying to kind of understand what's going on, and often I think we have to do that just as much with people.
100%. But you're not necessarily working with 60 people at any given time, as I've read that you've done with dogs. Right?
Yeah.
How do you do that?
With great difficulty. Obviously, it's never an individual thing either. There's teams of people helping you out, but that is part of the fun element of rescue, I guess, is how it differs to more private behaviour work. Is you tend to have a couple of clients, but rescue, you walk in the morning and you're just putting out fires. Is how it often feels like. There's dogs everywhere, and maybe you had a perfectly planned day, and now an emergency has come in, or something's happened, or been a dog fight, and your whole day just goes to poo. You have to kind of rethink about your whole day. So it's always kind of challenging and moving, and that is part of the excitement and the joy as well. No day is ever the same. It never looks the same, and you end up doing a range of different things. And having really good notes is the good answer to trying to remember everything just doesn't work. So having a great to-do list and knowing what you did last time so you can improve on it this time definitely helps.
I don't know, what kind of systems do people use in rescue? Do you have a CRM or a DRM?
Yeah, it's really varied. There's a lot of different software, and as you said, it's getting better and better at being used. But we do have CRMs for our dogs to collect all of that information, because again, there's so much happening: the medical history, the behaviour, and what another you were asking earlier about how things are changing. Another big shift that we're doing is before. We used to sort of look at behavior as like this static point of time. So more like a photo, like the dog did this when I introduced him to this person. How we're moving now is much more observational. So rescues are trying to get better at just really understanding who that dog is, how they react in all of these different situations, to create that profile for the dog, so that when you then match them to a home, is going to be as good a fit as possible. Versus, before, where we used to put a dog into a situation and then say, right, okay, well, when I introduced them to this dog, they barked at it, so they must not like other dogs. But actually, what happens when we go on a walk? What happens when we do this, when we do that? It's much more about collecting information. And then we could probably spend another hour talking about technology, like you've just mentioned, because there's a lot of work. One of my friends is currently doing their PhD on how we can use artificial intelligence to help us with welfare, because dogs in rescue are spending probably 23 hours a day in the kennel by themselves. That's a hell of a lot of information that we're just missing out of, because nobody's got time to sit and watch all of that. So, what happens if we film the dog? What can AI do to tell us about that information, to capture the struggles, the positives, the good things that are happening, so that we can continue to kind of improve welfare?
That's fascinating. Oh my God, I can see challenges already with like foldy faced dogs, and like being able to actually read what they're experiencing, the challenges around that. Do you spend more time in consulting at the moment, or working with rescues? And also, where are you happiest at this moment in time, and where can you add the most value at this moment in time?
Yeah, that's another really nice question. So currently, most of my time is going to staff development. So improving knowledge, improving skill within organizations and staff and volunteers. Because, the better we are when we're working with dogs, the better opportunities they can have, the better welfare they can have. And kind of realize, I love working with dogs, obviously. I would happily go back to a centre tomorrow. But I'm also really passionate about developing people and giving people the right tools. The kind of motto for my business is empowering rescues to improve behaviour health. So a big focus of mine is how do I take my experience, what I've learned from others, and how do I impart that so, again, we can improve welfare on a bigger scale? Because there's only so much you can do as one person. But, if we continue to raise standards as an industry, we're going to do a lot better for the dogs. So that's kind of the big passion of mine at the minute, even though I also love going and getting that dog out of the kennel and seeing the improvements that they can make while you're working with them.
What's the mix
I
at the
do less of
moment?
that now.
Pardon? Oh, you do less of it, but
Yeah,
I guess
0%.
really
Pretty
interesting.
much, yeah.
Because I found that, like my career in marketing, when I was working as a head of marketing, some of the more technical hands-on things, you kind of deal slightly more on the management and the strategy side, and so less on the kind of technical. And I felt that, like, by kind of taking my finger off the pulse of the tactical side of things, I felt personally that I was being left behind. And so I went back to the tactical because I get a lot more feedback and a lot more joy through the creation process. Is that something that you would deal with in the dog world, or would your career of 15 plus years kind of make up for that? It's the people that change, the dogs are the same.
So it's another topic that we could probably spend an hour discussing is, have dogs changed as well as people? But no, you're totally right. Like, it's a skill set, and every day is a learning day, and we're always continually improving. And I don't for the second think I still feel uncomfortable when people call me an expert, because I just think there's so much we don't know, um, that it feels a strange situation to be in. But yeah, it is a challenge, and obviously I am conscious of that, and that's why I'm really lucky to work with a range of organizations, and that does mean that I can spend time going in and traveling. And as you mentioned earlier on, I've been really lucky to go to like Bulgaria and different places, to Spain with the Galgos, to
Oh, really? Please tell me about
yeah.
that.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I went to Galgos de Sol, which is an amazing organization outside of Murcia, the Murcia region of Spain, and do some staff training there, but also work with some of the dogs. So that was super cool, because you've got to keep your hand in as well for the skills. But also, I think my big passion in staff training is helping people to do it then and there. So, the improvements that we can make by saying, try this. What do you think about that? Let's do this. And that's what the majority of my role has been for the last 6 years, but before it slightly changed in the summer. In 2 weeks' time, I'm going to Shrewsbury, a rescue in Shrewsbury, and we're going to do some dog mixing to build staff's confidence in introducing dogs to other dogs, which is my all-time favourite part of working in rescue. When you find two dogs who maybe struggling a little bit in kennels, or they're a bit worried about the situation that they've ended up in, and they go into a field and they play together, and you just see that kind of pure joy that comes from the two dogs playing together with no boundaries, because as humans we lose our ability to play very early on. And yeah, it's just my favorite thing to see is when you get it right and the dogs get on. So hopefully we'll have some really great success in 2 weeks, and that will really boost their confidence to continue to do that.
That sounds incredible. Dogs playing together and free running dogs, like just no harness, no nothing, just legging it through a
Yeah.
field or a forest. It's just magic. It is how it should be, or at least in my opinion. But yeah, it's magical to witness. I hope all goes well for you. Where did you say that was going to be? Shrewsbury?
Shrewsbury, yeah.
What country is that?
Yeah. Yeah, not
That
quite
was
as
a joke.
exotic. Gonna get my waterproofs out, I think.
Yeah, it will definitely be wet. Right. So we are running slightly over time. So maybe one more question.
Yep, that's perfect.
I think in the dog world sometimes, especially, you can be exposed to so many things that feel unfair, like injustice. We've touched on a couple of things, but there's actually a whole host of other issues and challenges in the dog world that we haven't touched on. So in your day to day, those things can all come at a cost, personally, mentally, emotionally, physically. What do you do to keep your edges soft and kind of keep going.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to discuss actually, because probably a couple of years ago I was pretty burnt out and I actually hadn't really realized, but it was talking to a friend that made me kind of click, oh, something's not quite right here. And what I found for myself was I was like getting in my work van, driving to my centres on autopilot, not really thinking about it, spending the day there, not really thinking about it, coming back, and just in a routine. And like I said, I haven't really noticed, but I think the big thing for me is having a good support network around you, having friends, family, spending time outside of dogs. Particularly if we're a dog professional, we're pretty bad at doing that because our downtime is going out with our own dog or doing agility or doing whatever you like to do, and that's great. But I do think it's important that we also have time away from dogs. It's also about speaking to people. We said earlier on that as a nation we're not great talking about how we feel and our experiences and things. And I think it's important that we do speak to people who can get it and just get it out. And it's also just having things that you love that refill your cup. So for me, it's anything to do with the sea or water. I'm an absolute water baby. I love it. I'm super lucky. Now me and my partner moved house in January, and we can see the sea from our house now. We literally live across a car park, and then we're in the sea. And I swim, I paddleboard, I dive, I surf. Pretty much anything that's in the water is how I fill my cup up. And one of the reasons I absolutely love diving is when you're under the water, you struggle to think about anything else because there's cool things to look at. You're underwater. You're not supposed to be there. It's much easier to let things go. I've just started mountain biking, which I'm really enjoying because it's really hard to think about what's going on at work when you're constantly feeling that you're going to die because you're about to fall off your bike, which is always the fun thing with learning something new, isn't it? It's always scary to start with. But yeah, finding things that fill your cup and having a good support network around you, I think, is super important because that's we lose a lot of good people from the industry every year, as with veterinary technicians and all of the other challenging professions. So it is really important that we find things that raise us up so that we are more resilient and more able to cope. I was speaking to somebody recently who's a researcher who's looking at how do we support mental health in shelter and rescue, and she introduced me to the term empathic strain, which I really like compared to something like compassion fatigue or burnout, because I think for me, empathic strain just means that you're a little bit stretched, but you've got that ability to come back from it. Whereas I think when we hear the term like compassion fatigue or burnout, you're kind of done. It's hard to come back from those terms. And we said earlier on, right? It's just language. But I really like that idea of empathic strain. Some weeks you can be more strained than others, and we just want to make sure that we've always got that ability to bounce back and stay ourselves while we're working in this challenging place. Yeah, that's it for me. The sea and now the mountain.
It's a massive challenge that. I love that. I'm going to research empathetic strain. Before we go, is there anything that you're looking forward to other than Shrewsbury? Anything you're working on? Anything that you want people to know about?
Yeah, it's a lot I'm looking forward to, I guess. So yeah, I've just been asked to write a chapter in a book, so I'm pretty looking forward to that. I never did very well at English at school, and I didn't get very good grades, so it's quite nice to be featuring in a book, and that's looking at how we can keep pets and people together. So a lot of the conversations that we talked about tonight, how do we support dogs where the problems are, rather than just taking them in. So obviously something that I'm really passionate about, and hopefully will help organizations and rescues set up programs to help support people. So I'm really excited about that. And then, like you said earlier on, I'm really lucky to be able to travel to some amazing places, and I'm going to spend some time at a shelter in Vermont in April, so that'll be pretty cool. A couple of other places. Yeah, lots going on.
Lots going on. So where can people learn more about you or connect with you, and who should be in touch with you?
Yeah, so the best place is my website, so Simplifying Shelter Behaviour .com, and that has kind of all of the things that I offer. It's got links to the podcast. It's got all of the services that I offer professionally. So that's a good kind of roundabout place to go. And then, like I said, I've also got the podcast, which is aimed at people primarily working and volunteering in rescues and shelters. And I get a range of different people on to talk about different behaviour topics and how we can simplify the very, very difficult work that we do. So that's the same, Simplifying Shelter Behaviour, and that's on all of your kind of podcast apps. And then I'm also on social medias where I put tips and tricks out and have conversations and put my thoughts out into the world. So yeah, if that interests you, they're the best places to go.
Wonderful. Tom Candy, you have been a stellar guest. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. I wish you continued success and thank you for all that you do for dogs and for humans across the country and the world. And hopefully we will see you on the podcast again in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to come back. It's been a really great conversation. Thank you very much.